I decided a while ago that I wanted to paint a wooden box for my friend Patricia, a kind of belated birthday present. This is actually one of the first process videos that I filmed, so you may notice things aren't quite as polished as some of my other videos filmed on my wooden desk. But I notice as the process goes on, my filming improves. I had reached a kind of state of burnout earlier in the year, and had found that a really nice way of recovering from being essentially what felt like a human printer was to create things for friends in mediums that I hadn't used in a long time. It was actually something a friend suggested because I had been creating ink drawings so obsessively that I just became, just so exhausted, and I found I just suddenly completely lost all my motivation for creating art, and it was very upsetting because on the one hand I really wanted to create, but on the other hand I just couldn't bring myself to make anything. Due to my friend's suggestion of exploring different mediums as a way of kind of still engaging in creative things, I decided to try painting again. It had been quite a while since I had painted anything, and something that I find very relaxing is painting animals. I actually find it quite easy to paint animals, and it was something I became quite good at when my work was actually very different. I used to create quite colourful illustrations in acrylics, and now I enjoy using this skill for painting wooden boxes and other small projects. My friend has a rabbit called Ursä, and I thought it would be really sweet to paint a jumping rabbit on a box for her with gold embellishments. So I've painted this box in black acrylic, and once dry I penciled in the outline of the rabbit. I then use acrylic gesso, or gesso, I say gesso, to essentially prime that area that I will want to paint the rabbit. This is really important, and I will share later a story of a commission I had right out of university that went completely wrong, partially due to my lack of an experience of painting on wood and other strange objects. So I really have to apologise that these clips are not in focus. Thankfully, this part does not involve lots of fine details, and I'm just filling in the area I will paint all the rabbit's details later. My filming has improved a lot over the months, and in the beginning it could be really hard to tell if the image was in focus in the small viewfinder. I've gotten much better at checking this regularly while I work, but it can take a bit of getting used to. When you are someone that is used to being very absorbed in your work, you can really forget that you need to check the viewfinder to even see if you're in frame. Filming is a skill, and I am still learning, but I am very happy to say the rest of this video should be in focus. So the white gesso I'm using allows my acrylics that I use on top to lay smoothly and grip onto the gesso. If the paint underneath is too smooth or glossy, the paint kind of just moves around without bonding properly to the surface underneath, and you won't have an even finish with each stroke of the paint. It will kind of just move around and it won't lay flat and evenly. I'm now just finishing some of the smaller details like the legs and the paws of the rabbit. I am adding whiskers and tiny details of the fur just to make sure my rabbit looks extra nice and fluffy. I am now mixing the exact shade of grey that I want for the fur. I was surprised to find that I needed to add some blue in it to brighten up the grey a little. I think colour theory can be quite surprising at times, and there are often all sorts of colours inside something that often you don't expect it to have, and grey is an interesting one because you can have warmer greys and cooler greys, and it can be quite interesting to explore the way how colour works. And I'd really recommend anyone that wants to improve their art to really explore colour theory and just start off with very simple experiments, and I think you'll find it really fascinating. Also, apologies for my makeshift paint palette. It's just a bit of cardboard. I have a really bad habit of not cleaning my paint palettes, and probably the one I usually use for my acrylics was probably covered in dry paint completely. My partner has often been horrified to discover my terrible treatment of my painting palettes, and it's just not something I'm very good at doing. I should really be better at cleaning them right after I use them. My favourite things about working with acrylics is how quickly you can build up the layers. I'm starting with a very light grey and using soft strokes to create the feel of the fur. I really love painting animal fur. It's so fun making them look so soft and fluffy. And for the base layers, I mostly focus on the right shades and general colour pattern of the fur before I add any more details. I work quite quickly, picking up lighter paint so that it blends into the darker paint that I have just used previously, so the paint is still wet, so the colours blend a bit more. You can also add a bit of water to your paint to help it dry less quickly, and this can really help with blending if you want to do a more blended effect. This is a very small painting, so I'm using a very, very fine brush. It is a 10/0 brush. I don't actually know if that's the correct way to say it out loud. Maybe just a 10-0 is how people say it. But I think it's one of the finest paintbrushes you can get. Finer ones definitely do exist, but they can be much harder to come by. And I bought this brush just in a local art store. I really loved adding the white paint to create the extra fluffy appearance around the neck and the belly. The last layers that I will add are the most detailed, and I use the finest strokes to give the feel of fur texture. I also paint the eye black, even though it's already black from the background of the box. I think this really adds an extra dimension to the eye once I add that extra paint. It makes it feel more like it belongs on the rabbit rather than it's something from the background. I then mix a soft and subtle pink tone for the inside of the rabbit's ears and a little sparkle in the rabbit's eye. I think this really brings the painting to life. Often it's these small highlights or shadows that really bring a piece to life and really make it very cohesive. Now to start the next part of the process, gold paint. I really love how gold embellishments look on black, and it both reminds me of celestial imagery and that kind of antique furniture that's black with very ornate gold embellishments. So I'm using gold acrylic paint. I do find, unless you're using a professional grade paint, that the gold paint may need a few layers to really build up the pigment enough, but I actually found this made it a bit easier to work with, as it felt a bit more like sketching and to build up the pigment. So I decided I wanted Patricia's box to have lots of crescent moons and stars on the sides of the box and next to the rabbit. I wanted it to both have a playful feel and also a more celestial, magical feel too. Maybe a place to keep small discoveries like stones, shells and pressed flowers, something kind of reverent. While I'm adding all these small gold details, I thought I would share my somewhat embarrassing commission story that I promised at the beginning, involving my lack of experience with painting on wood. So I'd shortly finished university. I had done a course in illustration, and I was approached by somebody that knew somebody else that knew somebody else. So I vaguely knew the people that were commissioning me. And basically all of their grandchildren had hand-painted stools, like little chairs. They had them done at some kind of establishment, some kind of business offered it this service, but they were no longer doing it. So they wanted somebody else to paint these chairs for their youngest grandchild who didn't have her own chair. They gave me examples. The mother of the child had given examples of the exact illustrations that she wanted painted onto the chair. They showed me examples of the past chairs they had done. And honestly, the two styles were completely different. I will say that I think everyone is kind of at fault in the story, but I definitely, my inexperience plays a huge role in why this commission didn't go very well. And I really should have asked like a lot more clarifying questions, but I basically took exactly what they said and I thought, well, I'll paint the examples that they have given me. The examples they gave me were completely different to the style of illustration I do or did at the time. But I took it on regardless, because I think when you're inexperienced, you get quite excited about any kind of commission. They were not offering very much for the commission at all. It was like really very underpaid. They said that it's the same amount that they paid the establishment, which I found really strange. £40 really isn't that much, and I know especially for this particular family it wouldn't have been very much, but it is what it is. So this is where my inexperience with painting onto wood and any kind of object really came into play. I started painting. The chair was already painted white, and I noticed when I started to paint with acrylics onto the chair that they were just kind of the paint was just kind of sliding around, and it wasn't laying flat and it wasn't laying evenly, and I found this really strange. I just kind of worked with it, and it was quite frustrating. I had to keep waiting for layers to dry to then paint on top. And basically this chair had been painted either in gloss white paint, or it had been painted and then varnished, and putting acrylics on top of varnish or any kind of gloss paint is extremely difficult. I really should have contacted them and let them know that this was not a good base to start, because it basically just means that the longevity of the paint is going to be compromised. Like, that acrylic is probably going to fade much quicker than it should, or get rubbed off or come off or chipped off much easier. But they did also tell me that they were going to varnish the chair after I was done painting it. I just wanted to quickly interrupt this story just to explain that right now I'm adding Patricia's name to the front of the box. And the funny thing about this is, despite writing down her name in the sketchbook first to make sure I spelt it all right, I still somehow missed one of the I's out of her name, and I don't realise until after the whole box is finished and varnished. So until the very end of this video, her name is spelt incorrectly. To make things even more ridiculous, this is not the first time I have misspelt her name on something I have given her, and I didn't even realise until after I'd inked the piece. Thankfully, the beauty of acrylics is that it can always be painted over. Apparently I am somebody that really struggles with spelling and noticing mistakes. I have dyscalculia, which is basically dyslexia but with numbers, so I wonder if some of that kind of trickles down into words too as well sometimes. Anyway, back to my story. It was also requested of me to outline the flowers and the buttons they wanted painted in a black outline, I guess kind of like a cartoon style, like the examples they had given me. And I wasn't keen on this idea, but they had asked me to do it, so I did it. If you imagine how awkward it could be to paint onto a strangely shaped object, I could tell from where I had placed the flowers and buttons that outlining them using a paintbrush and black paint would be extremely hard, so I used a pen instead. This was not a good idea, but again I told myself, well, they're going to varnish it, so even if the pen isn't the perfect medium, if they varnish it, it should be fine. Yes. So I was done with the chair and I gave it to them, and then they were heading up to see their grandchildren to give them the chair. When I handed it to her, the lady, she said it was sweet, she seemed fine with it. I assumed everything was fine, and I basically didn't hear anything for, I want to say 2 weeks, but it might have been longer, 2 or 3 weeks. And basically I got an email from her. They said that they were a bit disappointed with the painting on the chair, which I found quite devastating and a bit confusing, because I had really painted exactly what they had asked for. I'm not really sure what they expected. They also attached examples of the past chairs that they had had painted, and I was also quite confused by this, because I thought, well, you asked me for a design that was very different from the past chairs you had painted. So I was just very confused by this. I'm not sure what they expected. I'm sure it didn't help that the paint quality probably wasn't as good as it should have been due to the surface not being correct. I didn't even know gesso existed at this point, by the way. I learnt about this later on when I got more into painting. And then the final thing was that the little girl who the chair was for, she noticed that, I really hate that they added this into the email. They could have just said, we noticed that the black liner around the buttons and flowers had started smudging, but they added in that their granddaughter noticed, and I found that a bit unnecessary, but whatever. They had noticed that it was smudging. I replied to them that I would be happy to repaint the chair, obviously free of charge, because at this point I felt completely mortified. I was really, really, really upset. I felt just so embarrassed. And I also said I used a pen because they requested that the buttons and the flowers were outlined like the examples they had given me, and that I thought that they were going to varnish the chair. They told me they didn't varnish the chair because they didn't have enough time to varnish the chair before they gave it to their grandchildren. So yeah, I kind of feel like everyone is wrong in this story, honestly. And I'm not really interested in like pointing blame. I'm more just sharing my mistakes and what I learned basically from this, so that you don't make the same mistakes I did. They replied and they declined my offer to repaint the chair, which I can understand, but I think I really felt like I wanted to kind of redeem myself, and they asked for half of the money back, which was also really humiliating. Just really humiliating having to send £20 back to these two very wealthy people. By that point, I really just wanted to be done with it. I wanted to completely forget that it had ever happened. I wanted to just move on. And I just felt so embarrassed and really very upset and very mortified. So after this, I vowed that I would never, ever, ever accept a commission that was one in a style that was not my style at all. I would never do that ever again, because you can't do your best work if it's not your work. And obviously there are some people that are trained to do that. For example, animators are actually trained to mimic other people's styles. They can work on a team, but that wasn't me. I also vowed to never accept a commission that I felt is underpaid. I also vowed to not accept commissions that I had a kind of intuitive bad feeling about, and I did have kind of a bad feeling about this commission. I really felt like they had quite high expectations for the amount that they were paying. Those two things just really didn't add up for me. I think when you kind of get a bad feeling, you should really listen to that, especially if there's all these other things that just aren't kind of adding up for you. And finally, I didn't vow this straight after, but quite a lot of time afterwards, when I was experimenting more with painting, I learnt about gesso. And that's when I was like, oh, that's what was happening with the acrylic paint when I was trying to paint on top of that chair. The paint just would not lay flat and neatly. It just kind of slides around. It's quite hard to explain unless you've experienced it. But yeah, if you're going to paint on any kind of surface that isn't, I guess, strong paper, you're going to have a really hard time painting, because gesso basically gives you the opportunity to create whatever texture you want on the surface. You can sand it down afterwards and make it smoother, although not too smooth, otherwise you will have issues with the paint on top. But for canvases as well, you should add gesso to basically create a much smoother surface. You can create lots of texture if you want. It's really, really an essential tool if you are going to do painting. You should always use gesso. And if somebody asks you to paint on an object and you can see that they have used gloss paint, do not accept the commission unless they're going to let you either paint over it in gesso or they give you just like a plain wooden chair, and even then you still need to paint over it with gesso. It was a really humiliating experience, but I was very young. This was a really, really long time ago, like maybe 10 years ago. I was super inexperienced. I had really only just started getting into painting. Prior to that, I really only did ink paintings, actually. So yeah, that was my experience that I wanted to share, and I just wanted to let you know that if you do have a commission and it goes wrong, I mean, allow yourself to be upset, but also allow it to also be a learning opportunity. We can learn a lot from mistakes, and I don't feel humiliation anymore. I really look back on myself with compassion, and I think I was just trying my best. I didn't have enough experience, and I didn't know that I didn't have enough experience. I think it's kind of funny and beautiful that now I really love painting on boxes and objects, and I feel like with my experience now, I easily could have done that commission, providing I was able to use my style of painting animals and plants, and providing the object was primed correctly and the pay was reasonable and all those kinds of things. But I think that's why I feel fine about it now and I don't mind talking about it, because I can see how much I've grown, and I really learnt from that experience, and just from creating more paintings, I learnt more and more about how you're supposed to paint onto different surfaces, basically. So as you can see, I am completely missing the second I in Patricia's name. It should come between the C and the A on the end. I have also added some lovely plant details all around the front of the box and a tiny crescent moon. I was a bit worried at this stage I had made it way too busy, but I decided to just keep going and that I could always paint over anything I wasn't happy with. Again, the beauty of acrylics. I do love moons. When I was a teenager, I was on DeviantArt and tried to make my own Elvish language, and my username on there was Dark Moon, but in my Elvish language I had made. I will not be sharing what it was though, because that profile still exists and has some painfully cringy poetry and teenage paintings on it. I might consider making a video one day talking and sharing the evolution of my art, as I think it could be really interesting. Just to see how I progressed and regressed and progressed again in my artistic practice. I was trying to decide the last detail to add to the sides of the box and decided on painting some ribbons tied into bows on either side, and this felt like something my friend would really love. So I penciled in the outline in order to paint over it in gold. And I decided even more moons are needed. Moons on the outside, moons on the inside, multiple moon faces all joined together. I did go back in with some black acrylic just to make one of the moons a bit thinner. I wasn't entirely happy with how it turned out until I had done that. I also used some black acrylic to top up any patches where I felt the black paint was a bit too thin. And now for my signature. I really love just adding in my simple initials with a little flair of black letter style. And a little fun fact, since I was little, I was always extremely adamant that the E in my name must be drawn like that, as a backwards 3. I don't know if there's like a technical name for that script, but I was also extremely insistent that my name also mustn't be shortened in any way. And now for varnishing. I am using a matte varnish that I bought from a local art store. I also really hate chemicals and strong chemical smells, so I am wearing a mask for this, and honestly I would recommend that you do too, and that you should probably do research about any art materials you're using to make sure they're not toxic or just to see if you should be wearing any kind of mask or gloves while you use them. I make sure to use a very clean and square brush. I think it's the perfect size for this box, as it can both cover a decent amount of surface area and cover small nooks around the hinges. I know that lots of people really love watching paintings being varnished, and I can really understand why. The varnish really adds so much depth and vibrancy to a painting, and it's really so satisfying to watch it come to life. Ah yes, the terrible moment where I varnish over the spelling mistake in her name. I corrected this off camera as I didn't realise until the day before I gave it to her, so I kind of panicked and couldn't quite decide if it would be charming if I gave it to her with a spelling mistake, but I really decided that it should be correct. What I did was I sanded over the last 3 letters, painted black over them, repainted the gold letters with the correct spelling, and then I revarnished that area. And now for varnishing the inside. This is just as important as the outside, because I was thinking if she wants to keep stones or objects inside, that they might scratch the paint away, and so it needs varnish to protect the inside. And here it is, Patricia's box. I gave it to her filled with feathers from my chickens, who very sadly all ceased to exist due to a ferret breaking into their coop last year. I was very devastated. I also added a very smooth shell that I discovered in the summer. I hope you enjoyed joining me on this process journey and hearing about my past embarrassing experiences. Be sure to ask any questions and perhaps I will answer them in future video voiceovers. I also have an online shop with prints, books and original creations, and I have plenty more videos sharing my drawing and sculpting journeys and processes. Take care.